Good evening, everyone. We did have folks from different continents register for this exclusive talk. A warm welcome to everyone tuning in. My name is Gautam Salwan. I'm one of the volunteers here at the Toronto Agile community. Before we begin, a quick note. If you run into any issues, Zoom related or audio, video, etc., just drop a message in the chat or email info@torontoagilecommunity.org. My awesome partner, Lawrence Ludlow, and I are on chat duty and ready to save the day. Now, on to tonight's intriguing topic. Agile is dead. Here's why that's a good thing. Not to worry, we are not here for a funeral service, and nor is there any somber violence, and definitely no need for black attire. So are we doing an eulogy for Agile, or are we here to celebrate a good old-fashioned reinvention of Agile? Who better to guide us on this topic than our speaker for this evening? With over 20 years in software trenches across various roles, he has spoken and presented at conferences internationally. He helps organizations solve their own problems by giving them tools and skills they need to become learning organizations. But tonight, he's here to play the agile necromancer, showing us how to resurrect what works and bury what doesn't. So buckle up with your open minds and join me in welcoming Super Todd Sharon. Todd, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much for that impressive introduction. Makes me sound much more impressive than I feel like I may be. I may not be able to raise the dead. I may not be a necromancer, but we'll see if we can get close to that. All right, so welcome to Agile is Dead. Here's why that's a good thing. It's a nice Halloween theme for it because, I started putting this together around October, but let's get into it. So a little bit about myself here, if my screen will respond. There we go. So that's my name, Todd Sharon. You can find me on X at Todd Sharon. That's CHARRON. I have a mailing list called Leadership Lessons Learned. You can find that at toddsharon.beehive.com. And if you remind me at the end of this talk, there is a little freebie that I'm going to be putting out in the next week or two that if you sign up for the list, you will get access to that. So stay tuned. I'll talk about that a bit later. And finally, you can email me, and there's my email address, todd@toddsharon.com. I'm very slow at replying to emails. X is much faster, or LinkedIn, if you're looking to get a hold of me. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this here. So first, let's set the stage a bit for what we're talking about. What I want you to understand today is my goal here today in this talk is to get you to think. I'm not here to tell you what to think about the subject or what to think about anything. That's up to you. But I want you to just start thinking about these things because it's an important thing to think about at this point in time in where Agile is as a movement. So the other thing, the caveat to follow that up with is, of course, I don't have all the answers. And I won't have all the answers. I just, again, want to get you thinking about these things, give you a different perspective, that then you can use that information to actually see if you can find the answers that are going to help you and your organization or your teams. So let's go back in time a little bit. As some of you may know, around 2019, I gave the closing keynote talk at the Toronto Agile Conference. And I kind of gave what I called kind of the state of the Agile Union, in which that was, to a very large group of people. I announced, of course, that Agile is dead. And that got some very mixed responses. But I actually started talking about it a little bit before that. We'll get to that in a second. Because one of the things I talked about there that I thought was really important that people understand is that when we think of Agile as a movement, we have to understand that every successful movement has its moment and every movement ends. And that's regardless of whether you think it's succeeding or failing, as successful as you can be, you are still going to end at some point in time. And if we understand that that's true, then we have to understand that the Agile movement itself at some point has to end. It's just inevitable. So around 2017, 2018, I started going around to a lot of Agile open spaces, and I posted a topic up there called Agile is Dead, Change My Mind. And people complain maybe it's a little bit provocative of a title. But the reason why I posted that and the reason why I framed it in that way is because I had gotten this feeling that the Agile movement was kind of coming to a close, that it's kind of dying. But I wasn't sure. I wasn't positive. So I really wanted people to change my mind. I actually was going in and saying, please change my mind, because I don't want it to be dead, but I'm thinking about it. And I figured when I went in there that some people would say, oh, okay, I agree, here's why. Or some people would say, oh, I disagree, and here's why. But that's not what happened at all. What happened instead was really fascinating. This was the most common reaction that I got. How dare you? How dare you even bring up this subject? How dare you even intimate that Agile might be dead or dying? And it was crazy because it was like I had touched a third rail. So before we go on, I just want to kind of set the temperature in the room here and just make sure you all understand what we're talking about here. So first off, it's okay. You can breathe. You can all take a deep breath here. Because in the end, no one is coming to steal your Agile. And if they are, apparently you can say swipe or no swiping a few times and that'll stop it and your Agile will stay. So the reason why I think this is important to talk about is because people seem to have internalized Agile as part of their identity. And I want you to understand that Agile doesn't have to be your identity. Agile doesn't have to define you as an individual. And I don't know about you, but for me, like I didn't get into this to be Agile. That wasn't my goal. So when I first got into Agile, it was around 2005. I started working for a company that was doing extreme programming, and they were doing it very badly. And but it was my first exposure to Agile, so I started looking into it. And the reason I was getting into it, not because you have to do this Agile stuff, you have to be Agile. It was we have problems. We have problems in the way that we're working, and we're trying to figure out ways to solve those problems. And it seemed like this Agile thing had a lot of solutions to a lot of the problems that we were having in our organizations. So the important thing to remember is Agile was never the goal. It was never the end state. It wasn't the goal to be Agile, it wasn't to be the most Agile company in the world. It was we have problems and we need solutions, and Agile seems to have a lot of the solutions here. So one of the things that came up in those open spaces was, well, everyone would say, well, what do you mean? What is Agile? And it's like, wow, if we're in 2017, 2018, and we still don't know what Agile is, well, that's clearly a sign of a problem. But let's actually go back in time and discuss this a little bit. So one of the things I've discovered going back and looking at the Agile Manifesto is, you've got the values and you got the principles and everybody talks about that. But as time goes on, I've discovered that really the most important part of the entire Agile Manifesto is the very first sentence. We are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. It's a very simple sentence, but really that is the main encapsulation to me. So there are things we have to understand when we go back. So remember, Agile Manifesto comes out 2001. Obviously, we'll talk about some of the things that pre-exist the Agile Manifesto. But we have to recognize that the context of Agile back in 2001 is very different than the context of Agile in 2024. And so we have to look at how the context has changed. So here are just a few ways in which the context has changed. So something I refer to as the Agile knowledge gap, it kind of grows over time. So when I was getting into Agile, I said, well, hey, what's this Agile stuff? It's 2005, 2006, 2007. How do I learn about this Agile stuff? Well, you start reading some books. So back then, if you read these 3 books, if you had Extreme Programming Explained, Agile Software Development with Scrum, Lean Software Development, if you had read and understood those books, you were pretty good. You were in pretty good shape at that point. But in 2024, if I said, well, hey, I want to get started with Agile, where do I start? And I say, well, let's look up books on Agile software development. And you're going to get over 1,000 different books in there. It's like, well, okay, well, which ones do you need to start with? Do you need to know all of these to be an expert? Are there ones that are better than others? How would I know is there a canon? I don't know. Where would I even start? It's very different than it was back then. So the other question that comes up then is, well, who is Agile? Are the same people that were looking into Agile back in 2001, or when I looked into it at 2005, are they the same as the ones looking at it now? Well, the audience changes over time. So when I first got into Agile, there were people in it that had a lot more experience than me. I'll put shout outs to Lawrence here, to Jason Chunky Yu and Alistair and Hino and Michael Sahota, because they were some of the first people I met in this space who really helped me along when I first got in. And there's probably others that I'm afraid to name. Alexi's another one. And when I think about that, it's like, well, there was a very small group of people, and I was the beginner, and there were people that knew a lot more than me, but they didn't know that much more than me because there wasn't that much more to know at the time. But as you proceed over time, as it gets more popular, more and more people come in. But those people who knew stuff, well, now they know more stuff because they didn't stop learning. They didn't just say, okay, we're good with this Agile stuff, we're going to stop learning. No, they learned more stuff. They became more advanced. And then as it gets even more popular, you get more and more people in. But again, that knowledge and experience, that tail end keeps going further and further away. So now a new person has so much more to learn if they want to get to the far right of this graph here. But then when you think about it, if you're an event organizer, let's say for an event like this or for a conference or whatever, who are you going to target as your audience? Well, you could target the people on the far right, but again, that's a small group of people. You're more likely to say, well, let's put together events that have sessions that appeal to beginners or intermediates or people who are just getting started, because there's a large number of those people that we can draw in as an audience. The problem with that, though, is then the people on the far right there of that graph who, have been coming to these events for a while say, do I really want to sit through another session on, how to use user stories or, how to run planning poker? It's like, probably not. So a lot of those people end up dropping off. And so your audience actually changes over time. And it's not just the knowledge of the gap between these people that changes, but also the type of person that ends up coming into the community changes over time as well. So I refer this is to kind of the gap between builders and innovators. And I want to be clear here about this. There's no preference of whether you should be a builder or an innovator. It's just a different intention. And one is not better than the other. So in the early days, you get innovators who see this new stuff going on in Agile, and they say, I want to be a part of that Agile scene. I want to be part of the new ways of working that they're developing. I want to try some of this stuff, even though it might be, a little rough around the edges. Maybe it doesn't work perfectly. I want to take that risk. And I also want to contribute back and say, hey, well, we tried this stuff and it's cool, and we'll share with that. And those are the people who come in early. Those early adopters are that innovator mindset. But then what happens later on is you get builders who come in and their perspective is different. They don't really care about your Agile stuff. They just want to build cool products. It's like, I got this thing I want to build. I want to know what's the best way to build it. And people tell me that Agile is the best way to build it. So just come and teach me this Agile stuff. I want to know what are the Agile best practices. Some of you may have heard that before. And I remember, I don't know if it was around 2015 or something like that. That was a big conversation of, there are no best practices and, we need best practices. And that's kind of that clash of cultures about why people are coming into the space that changes over time. That's very different than, let's say, the early 2000s. So what also happens is you have a problem that happens between talent demand versus experience as Agile takes off. So as Agile starts to take off, we say, oh, we need help with this stuff. We need, Agile coaches and consultants to come in and help us. And it's like, well, okay, but if you look on the right of the graph, that's a very few number of people. Like I can tell you, back when I first started calling myself an Agile coach, which was probably around 2010 maybe, I knew all the Agile coaches I knew, I could count them on my hands, but every single one of them, I guarantee you, was excellent. And they still are. But now, you get this flood of people and they say, well, okay, we can't get those people on the far right. Then we'll get somebody with a little less experience, or a little less knowledge. And pretty soon, I've seen coaches like, oh, you're an Agile coach. How long have you been doing this? Like 6 months. It's like, really? 6 months? 6 months and you're going to go out there and coach organizations. It's like, well, okay, something is different. Something has changed. So it's important to recognize here as well that when people are looking for coaching, that coaching is learning from competent people with experience. So they have to have the knowledge, but they also have to have some experience with it, because that's what somebody who's coming saying, I want, help with our organization. I want someone to coach our organization. That's what they're looking for. And for a lot of the time, we see a lot now in the market that that's not necessarily what they're getting. And that's a bit of a problem. So let's look at part 3 then. So where is Agile? So probably around 2010 to 2012, there were a lot of blog posts about, I think it was Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm. Was a big book at the time, and this big graph went going around. It was like, well, has Agile crossed the chasm? Is it popular enough? Because we'd gotten through that innovator stage, and now we had some early adopters, but this is a lot of times where a lot of movements fail, is they fail to cross the chasm to get past that into more of the early adopters and eventually get acceptance into the early majority, the late majority, and eventually the laggards. But here's the thing. We're not having that conversation anymore. We're not having the conversation of, did Agile cross the chasm? It is very clearly across the chasm. The question is, though, well, where are we now? And I had some people say, no, clearly we're still in the late majority. We're not in the laggards. I said, really? Well, who are you guys working for? Oh, well, we're working for banks, insurance companies, and the government. It's like, okay, if that's your late majority, who's left after that? Like there's nobody left of the late adopters that comes after that. So we are definitely at the tail end of this chart here. And so again, you have to recognize there's a different audience between those innovators and early adopters and the late majority and the laggards, basically between like startups and banks. It's not the same context. And so that's going to impact where Agile is at. And we'll talk a little bit about in what ways that affects things. So I started to think about, okay, so what am I seeing? What am I seeing in these patterns? And does it fit anything that kind of explains what's happening and what's going on? And I started to think of Agile as a movement. And what I mean is there's very defined stages that social movements go through. And I feel like Agile has gone through these stages. So the four stages of social movements are emergence, coalescence, bureaucratization and formalization, decline, and institutionalization. So we're going to go through these each step by step and talk about where Agile fits into each one of these. So first, let's talk about emergence. So early days, pre-2001, when things are just kind of, we're sure something in the way we're working isn't right, but we need to do something different. And so we have to recognize that Agile was a backlash. And we recognize it now as a backlash between waterfall, but it wasn't really called waterfall back then. That was actually great Agile marketing. They decided to call that other thing we'll call that waterfall, and that's bad. It was great marketing. But really, it was considered at the time was it was like the software development lifecycle, and it was just how we do software. This is how we do software. And Agile said, no, we're going to call that waterfall for obvious reasons. And this is going to be a backlash against that. And there was a good reason to have a backlash against that because people were having a strong dislike and frustration with the way software development was going. And, for those of you who were there, you remember, for those of you who don't, there was a lot of pain that happened. I remember working on waterfall projects and seeing people's lives just in misery. I remember, divorces, late nights, overtime, working 7 days a week, burnout, on calls, all the stuff that would happen. For those of you who remember, like integration hell, which would happen because everybody would develop stuff separately on separate branches, and then you'd have a 6 month to a year-long project and you try to integrate it, and of course nothing works. And all these pains and suffering were going on at the time, and people said, well, hey, maybe we can do something better. And so originally you didn't have Agile, you had what were kind of known as the lightweight methods, which nobody wanted to be called the lightweight, so they had to come up with a new term, and that's how they ended up on Agile. But these lightweight methods started out not from some corporation somewhere that handed it down, or from some Ivy League school that came up with the best method, or a McKinsey Institute or anything like that. No, it was self-organized contributors that were talking on mailing lists, meetup groups, eventually on blogs, and they just said, hey, here's the stuff we're trying. Here's what's working for us. Here's where we're having problems. What do you think? And other people would try it and say, yeah, I tried it, but it didn't really work for me. But then we did this, and then it worked. And they would have that back and forth. And they started to find these other ways of working. So we have to recognize, again, that Agile in its beginnings was a DIY or a do-it-yourself approach. Again, we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. That's how it started. So in the early days, you had different things, and people took a lot of risks. And again, people don't necessarily appreciate today the risk people took back then to make these things possible. So you had things like test-driven development. You had pair programming, continuous integration. Obviously, we know about Scrum, XP. You also had Crystal, DSDM. But there were people that were going out here and trying things that could fail spectacularly and cost them their jobs, could cost their companies their business. Like imagine being one of the first people to go to your boss and say, hey, I got this great idea. I know we're a team of like 8 developers, but what if, hear me out, everybody paired? And then we would just sit at 4 desks and we'd have pairs. And like that would have sounded ridiculous at the time. What do you mean? I have 8 developers. They need to be working on 8 different things. You want them to pair up? That halves our productivity. Of course, obviously we know different now, but at the time, like that's what people were thinking. They had to go up against a management structure that really believed in these things. Or test-driven development. First off, why are you writing tests? Why aren't you just writing perfect code? And then, wait, we have to write and maintain all these tests? You've got to be kidding me. Now you want to write the tests first? Like there was a lot of ridiculous stuff that, was crazy ideas that work in retrospect, but at the time, like really people really put their necks out on the line to make these things happen. And, continuous integration, everybody looks at continuous integration software today, but there was a time when it was just an idea, this idea that we would continuously integrate, and we didn't have software to do it because We just had an idea, and then the software came later. So we really have to appreciate these early days. It really is that DIY, put it together with duct tape and just see what happens. And a lot of that cool stuff was happening in that era. But as you come out of that era, things start to coalesce. We start to figure out what are the things we have in common. We look at Scrum, Crystal, DSDM. We look at all these things and we say, well, what do we have in common? And of course, that brings us to 2001 Snowbird, Utah, Manifesto for Agile Software Development. When people came together and said, well, what are the things we have in common? How can we distill that down separate from the practices and say, here's the things we believe in? And this is another one of those things that people do not give enough reverence to, I think. You can just Google on the internet for approaches to software development, manifestos for software development, and all the ones you'll be like, oh, I vaguely remember hearing about that, or that thing came and failed, or I didn't even hear about that one. There are thousands of different people and groups that said, we know how we're going to improve software development, and you never hear any of them because it wasn't the right thing at the right place at the right time. And we have to recognize that this kind of success is super rare, that somehow we got the right people in the right place at the right time to make this happen. And it's like a butterfly effect. It's like you couldn't change any of it. And I know people say, well, what if they had done this in there instead of that? Or what if this person had been there instead of that person? No, none of this happens. It would all fall apart because that's what happens 99% of the time. So suddenly in 2001, we start to get some of the success. But as the success comes, new people like myself get interested in this, and we suddenly say, hey, we've got some questions about this Agile thing you just put out. Like, what is Agile? What makes a team Agile? What is Scrum? What is extreme programming? And these are questions that were not really easily answerable at the time because they were in progress. They were in development. Things were changing all the time. And I remember, like, for the longest time on like the XP mailing, there was huge amounts of resistance to codifying anything with extreme programming because once you say what it is, guess what? You're into the next phase. Bureaucratization and formalization. Again, this is inevitable. This is part of success because when those people have those questions, you have to provide answers and they have to be consistent answers. It can't just change every hour or day to day or whatever. But when you do this, edgier bits of your movement starts to get sanded down because things can't change as rapidly. You can't just go try any crazy stuff because we have to have some level of consistency if we want things to actually catch on and get any sort of broader support outside of a small group of individuals. So the movement eventually becomes codified. And this is why you have things like scrum.org, Scrum Alliance, the Scrum Guide, Lean Kanban University. These all come out because there is a need. If you want to grow your movement, you have to codify it at some point in time. I think, I think I'm getting this correctly, but I remember there was huge amounts of resistance to actually having a formal Scrum guide until this group put out the Scrum PMBOK, I think it was, this huge book of everything they said, which was Scrum, and it was like all wrong. And finally, they're like, okay, no, this is ridiculous. We can't let them use the name and say that this is Scrum because it's not even what it is. We have to have a Scrum guide. But the problem with that is, as you start doing this, you've now codified it. And once you codify it, it's going to start to get reproduced. People are going to look at these guides. They're going to go get their certification. They're going to copy what they've learned. And this introduces what I call generational loss. And for those of you who may remember VHS tapes or audio cassettes, you know what I'm talking about. Because in a digital world, you can just copy something and it's an exact copy bit for bit, but not in an analog world. In an analog world, if you take a VHS tape and you copy it to another VHS tape, you'll notice a little bit of quality will drop off. You'll notice a little bit of sound quality will drop off, picture quality. And then when you copy it again, if you copy that copy, it gets worse and worse and worse and worse until eventually it's just a fuzzy mess. And this is what we start to see happen as people start to copy Scrum and different Agile approaches. The copies end up constraining what is allowed. So we lose some of the stuff that our initial ones that we copied from, and then also we say like, well, hey, that's not Scrum because we did Scrum at my last company, and that means we did X. It's like, so we have to do X. So now we're not allowed to do things out of that because that's no longer allowed. So it must be this specific thing done in this specific way, but we copy from a copy from a copy, and you end up like a game of broken telephone, and you see very, very weird Agile and Scrum implementations out there as a result of this effect. But it's inevitable. It is natural. It is what ends up happening. But what happens here, of course, is you lose that do-it-yourself edge. That do-it-yourself edge of trying new things, trying to break things, all things that are happening, it kind of disappears. And the risk takers get pushed out. And I remember seeing a very great example of this in real time was one day on Twitter, there was explosion because there was a hashtag called no estimates. And you couldn't talk about no estimates. That really offended a lot of people and got a huge amount of a flame war started. And the problem was because you had people who were trying to be more on that DIY edge. Here's the stuff we're trying. Here's something that's different. Here's what it is. But you had people who were working in larger organizations, again, perhaps banks, insurance companies, whatever, who are saying, what are you doing? Stop. If my boss hears that Agile means we don't estimate anything, we will never get approved. And so it's like, no, they try and push that out because, again, that's going to reduce their attempts at getting things adopted. And so, of course, inevitably, when you end up in this path, it ends up being commercialized. And, well, that's just one particular example there of commercialization, but there are many others. And that's inevitably going to happen over time. And we see this with, again, you could say with certifications, with SAFe, with whatever, there are efforts to commercialize it, copy it, and reproduce it. And so eventually, when you come out of this phase, you're going to end up in decline. Again, even if you are successful, every successful movement you have ever heard of entered into this phase. It is inevitable that you'll enter this phase. And as Eric Hoffer put it, every great cause begins as a movement, becomes a business, and eventually degenerates into a racket. And again, this is just one of those inevitabilities of life. It's neither good nor bad. It just is, in the same way that water just exists, air is just there. So we have to look at the ways that movements decline. So repression, organizational failure, and I'll talk a bit about what that means in this context, success, co-optation, establishment within mainstream society. So repression is the obvious one. That just means, well, no, we're just not doing that anymore. So we started doing Agile and then the boss came in and said, no, we're not doing Agile and crushes it. That's simple repression. But let's look into the other ones a bit more. What do we mean by organizational failure? So organizational failure is when your movement actually fails to stay cohesive, when it kind of spreads out and becomes more than what it was, or it no longer means what it originally means. And this is what I refer to as the everything is Agile problem. And you've probably all seen this, and it's all happened and continues to happen time and time again, which is, you have Agile marketing, you have business agility, you have Agile banking, all this sort of stuff, and everything is suddenly Agile. And this goes back to when I was having those open spaces and would have to spend time talking with people saying, well, wait, but what do you mean by Agile? It's like, well, if we don't even understand what Agile is anymore, we're kind of at this point of the movement because it's become everything to everyone, which means nothing to no one. Or as Jerry Weinberg put it in his book, I think it was Secrets of Consulting, the law of raspberry jam, which is the more you spread it, the thinner it gets. So again, the more we try and apply Agile to everything, the less it ends up applying to anything. And we have no cohesion at that point. So the next thing that can happen, of course, is co-optation. And, all I have to do to say that co-optation may have happened, again, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing is up to you, is where are all the developers at? Right? For the manifesto for Agile software development, somewhere along the way, we lost a lot of developers, which is a little strange, again, unless your movement has grown to the point that you are getting some form of co-optation. Again, whether that's a good or a bad thing, I'm not here to judge on that, but that's a thing that's going to happen, and it's a thing we've clearly seen happen with Agile as well. So then you get establishment with mainstream society, which again, if you see Agile on the cover of the Harvard Business Review, you're pretty much mainstream at that point. It's no longer fringe blogs or mailing lists or anything like that. You are mainstream at that point. So we have to recognize the reality. Reality is Agile is now mainstream, which means the revolution once was the revolution is now the orthodoxy. So Agile has now become the orthodoxy. Which, if you don't have get Monty Python references, we can go with the Star Wars one. Agile has become the empire. That's where we're at now. Now, the good news about this is, of course, empires are ripe for disruption. As Waterfall was for before Agile, Agile is now itself ripe for disruption. Now, before we go that, one more part. I want to do a little sidetrack here in defense of Scrum, because as people talk about Agile is dead, people are becoming more critical of Agile. It seems it's very popular to dump on and critique Scrum, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad. But I think I want to put it in its context so it's kind of done in the right way. So one question people get is, does Scrum work? And there's always a study that says, well, Scrum fails or this fails and that. In my opinion, from what I've seen with all the teams that I've coached doing Scrum, every single time, whether the organization succeeds or fails, Scrum does what Scrum does. Every single time, 100% of the time. The question is, what do you think Scrum does? Because a lot of people go out, Jeff Sutherland loves his, 200 per times the work in a fifth of a second or whatever. It's always faster, it's always more. But that's not really what Scrum does. And I think it was Ken Schwaber who originally talked about this way, way back when. What Scrum really does is it takes all of your problems in your organization and it makes them very visible and very painful. And if you don't do anything about it, that's a bad thing. But what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to solve the problems that Scrum surfaces. And if you solve them, you'll get benefit. If you don't solve them, your life is going to be very, very painful. So I'll give you an example. I was working with one company and we said, okay, we want to try doing Scrum. I said, well, they were like, well, how long a sprint should we do? I said, well, hey. And I knew, I'm like pulling the pin on the grenade and throwing this in there. I'm like, how about we try 1 week sprints? Let's see how that goes. And of course, there's just, oh my God, chaos, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, okay. Maybe we can't do 1 week sprints, but why can't we do 1 week sprints? I said, well, it takes us 3 days to get a build. So we have 5 days of work, 3 days to get a build. We can't do it. Oh, that's interesting. So is the problem 1 week sprints and the problem Scrum, or perhaps the problem, it takes you 3 days to get a build? And it's like, oh, okay, maybe that's the problem we need to solve, right? So already, before they had even implemented Scrum in any way, shape, or form, Scrum had already surfaced a problem in their organization. And guess what? You solve that problem, you'll find another problem will come up, and you'll have to solve all those problems. And the great thing about Scrum is Scrum really does help you solve a lot of those waterfall problems. If you have to get to working software in a time box period of time, it's going to surface a whole bunch of the problems that you wouldn't notice if you were doing a 6-month or a year waterfall project. Again, having 3 weeks of integration and then, 5 weeks of testing or whatever, all those problems that come as a result of that, they're going to start to go away as you solve the problems, as you try to deliver working software in 2 weeks, in 1 week, in 3 weeks, whatever. You're going to have to solve a lot of those problems. And that's great news. The bad news is, of course, once you solve the waterfall problems, now you have Scrum problems. Well, what could Scrum problems be? Well, so here's the thing. Nothing in this world comes for free. I hate to break it to you. It is always going to be a series of trade-offs. So we had all these waterfall problems and we solved them by, let's say, doing some of the Scrum stuff. Great. But that doesn't mean there isn't a cost to doing those things. So you might ask yourself, so, you have a lot of people complain in Scrum and say, well, look at all these meetings we have. We have so many meetings. Well, I mean, the original idea around it was, well, yeah, you would have those ceremonies and those meetings, but that would kind of be all you would need. Everything else you could just do ad hoc. Except what most organizations do is they keep all their normal organizational meetings and then say, we're going to add Scrum meetings on top of that. It's like, oh, well, that's interesting. So now you have to figure out how to solve those problems, because whatever becomes your most burning problem is going to be the one that you have to solve. So you end up getting in this weird divide of, are we heretics? Are you zealots? Do we just need pragmatists? And what it really comes down to at the end of the day is, we hear a lot of talk about, well, is it purity, the Scrum purists, and versus, well, we just need to do what works, whatever that means, the pragmatists. But we also have to account for incompetence. And I don't think we account for that enough because, because there's a lot of incompetent Agile out there. Let's just say, let's just be honest. I have gone into organizations that say they're doing Agile, and there's a lot of incompetent Agile out there. But then people will come back and they'll say, well, no true Scot, no true Scot, right? Like a no true Scotsman. It's like, you can say, well, they just weren't doing it properly. It's like, well, maybe they are doing it properly, and maybe there's a reason why they're struggling. But there's also a very good chance that they're just not doing it properly. Like, really, there is a lot of incompetence out there. So let's talk a little bit about some of that I've seen. So a lot of the reasons why I see a lot of bad Scrum and a lot of bad Agile out there is people just don't know better. They really just don't. And that's okay. You're going to have to learn. It's going to be a learning journey. So one organization I went into, and they said, we'd like to bring you in to help us. We just started doing Scrum. It's great. And we'd like to bring you in because we think we could be even better. Awesome. Cool. So what are you doing right now? Well, between 9 and 10 a.m., we all gather in the boardroom and we do our daily Scrum. Okay. Between 9 and 10 a.m., you do a daily scrum. It's like, yes. And it's fantastic. Like, oh, okay. I'm not going to ask you how bad things were before you had this 1 hour meeting every day. So I said, okay, that's good. You're getting some benefit out of that. What else? What else are you doing? That's it. We're doing Scrum. Oh, so you do a 1 hour status meeting every day from 9 and 10 a.m. And it's fantastic. Do you think you can help us do better? Like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I can, right? And sure enough, they brought me in there and we did do things a lot better, but it's like they had no idea. To them, doing a scrum was doing a 1 hour status meeting every day. And again, their communication was so bad that this was an improvement on what they were doing. So good for them. But let me ask you this though. Is that then a scrum success or a scrum failure? I mean, they thought it was fantastic. But if they weren't getting results, would that be a scrum failure? It's like, this is why it's so hard to say. It's like, well, what were they even doing? I don't even know. I don't even know what you would call that. But then, that's not really a scrum success or a scrum failure. One of the other things I see is, sometimes you just wish it was something closer to what you want it to be. Like you look at Scrum and you say, man, I kind of think it's like this because that's how I would like this thing to be. I see this a lot if you only understand Scrum or Agile, let's say from a traditional project manager worldview, well, then things look a certain way. But if you have experience with them, then you say, oh, it's not that. But if you don't, you'll try and ram that square peg into that round hole. So this is where you see a lot of times like the daily scrum or stand up as like a status meeting. It's because they're used to status meetings. They understand status meetings, but they don't understand what a good daily scrum would look like. And I saw this in another organization I worked with where they had a project manager who was kind of part-time project managing a few teams. And she would come by and basically hijack the stand-up and turn it into a status meeting. And so she'd go around to everyone in the group and say, well, what percent done are you on this? And, they'd look up and make up some number, 82.5%. Great, 82.5%, write that down. And the team obviously hated this. They didn't like it at all. So eventually I pulled her aside. I'm like, okay, that's not really what the meeting's for. So we're not going to have that happen anymore. However, and this is the important caveat, it's like you can't just say to somebody, well, no, you can't do that, because the reason why she wants that is because she actually needed something of value from that meeting. She needed to understand where things were at because part of her role was to make sure the customer was happy with how things were progressing. So it's like you have a legitimate need to understand progress. However, the daily scrum is not the place for that. So I walked her over to the board where she could see tasks and said, guess what? We have, here's one of the work items. It has 4 tasks on it. 2 of them are done. What progress would you say is that? 50%. It's like, yeah, it's probably right, about right. You could probably use that. And sure enough, it was fine. So then later on, she would, attend the daily scrum, but as an actual participant, not trying to make it a status meeting, and would get all the status she needed because the team would make sure the board was up to date. So she didn't have to ask them what percentage done you are. She could just look and it was obvious. So again, that's just a different understanding of the context of the particular practice. Now, of course, one of the important things to understand about Agile or any practice or whatever it is you're doing in your organization is you have to understand why you're doing it. Why are we doing the things we're doing? Why do we have all these practices? Why do we have these meetings? Why are we doing this Agile thing at all? So I hopped on a call with an Agile Center of Excellence once. It was 3 people that I spoke to on this call. And they were saying, well, maybe bring you in, help us out with stuff. And they said, well, we've been at this Agile Center of Excellence thing for about a year now. I said, okay, cool. And the first question I asked, which by the way, if you're looking for some help and you're going to reach out and contact me, be prepared. This is going to be one of the first questions I ask is, so what problem are you solving for your organization? And they were silent. Just blank looks all around. It's like, we don't know. It's like, okay, so you are the coaches at the Agile Center of Excellence. You've been at this a year, helping the organization do what? Well, with Agile, obviously. Okay. In order to what? Nothing. Needless to say, I did not get a call back after that conversation. But hopefully, I hope they did eventually figure out what they were actually trying to help the organization do, because that's a vital part of it. So we kind of have to update when we're talking about coaching is, yes, coaching has to include learning from competent people, but you also need competent people who have experience helping you solve the problems that you have. Because you shouldn't be doing anything with Agile if you don't understand what problem in your organization you're trying to solve, because that's how we have to help your organization. So it's like, well, are you trying to get to market sooner? Is that your problem? Do you have a problem with innovation? Maybe this will help. Do you have a problem with quality? But whatever it is, we have to understand that what we're going to do is going to do in the purpose of solving that problem for you. So this is why things kind of get complicated when we talk about, well, is it good? Is it bad? Should you do this? Should you do that? Because there is a difference between a practice done poorly in the wrong context, which we can all recognize will fail every time and should fail every time, versus a practice done properly or done right in the wrong context, where it's not going to make a difference in solving your problems because it's not going to move the needle, versus a practice done poorly in the right context, where it's like, okay, it is the thing that's going to solve your problem, you just don't know how to execute it, versus the thing that we're actually looking for, which is, of course, a practice done right in the right context. So the right practice in the right place at the right time. And to simplify a bit, it understands that doing what works is not just doing what you're told, or not just doing whatever you want. While it's possible you could copy something and do what you're told and it works, it's entirely possible. It's also possible that you could do just random practices that sound good at the time, and some of them might work out. But really what we're looking for is, again, we want to make sure we're doing what actually works to help us solve our problem in our teams, in our organizations. So I'll also add here that through all the teams that I've coached, all the organizations I've helped, I've discovered there's one thing that will separate those who succeed and those who have failed. And guess what? I've worked with organizations and I would say absolute failure. Some of them I would work with say absolute success. And I will say the one thing that separates the successful versus the unsuccessful, which nobody ever talks about, so this might be the first time you've heard this, is will. That is the only thing that is going to actually move you from not successful to successful. And what I mean by will is, do you have the will to do the things that are necessary in order to succeed? If, whether you're doing Scrum or you're doing something else and it surfaces a problem, will you solve that problem? Or will you just say, nope, that's just the way it is? Well, if you can't change those things, if you can't solve those problems, if you're not willing to do the work to do those things, you will not have success, whether it's Scrum, whether it's some other Agile approach, doesn't matter what it is. If you're not willing to solve the problems, you will not have success. And so that's a very important part to understand when you're trying to make these changes in your organizations or in your teams. So we have to recognize at this point, though, 2024, that there is a lot of baggage that is associated with some Agile practices, and perhaps all Agile practices. So we can say, well, okay, well, we can just jettison some old Agile practices and say, well, we can let go of the baggage, just let it go. But then what? What are we left with at that point if we just say, well, we're just not going to do this anymore? For example, a lot of people say, well, we're not going to do planning poker anymore. Okay, but then what? So this leads us to our next part 6. So this is what I call the aspects of Agile. So in the aspects of Agile, and I've identified 5 of them, this is just kind of what I've distilled, and there's no clever marketing branding around this, unfortunately. I should probably do that at some point. But I just kind of distilled, what are the key things after over 20 years of doing this, separate from the practices that we've really learned, that we've really taken away, that, even if you got rid of all the practices, if you understood these things, you could find your way to being successful. And these are the 5 aspects: seeing the work, understanding the work, moving the work, crafting the work, and decentralizing decision-making. And again, we'll break down each of those. So what have we learned about seeing the work? Well, we've learned about the importance of transparency. This is why in the early days we had I don't think anyone uses the term anymore, but used to use the term information radiators, right? We had things up on the wall. They were in your face. You could see them. We could see our way into the system, regardless of the practice. Again, whether you're doing something digital or whether you're doing something physical, you need that transparency. We've learned that. You have to make that work visible so that people can see where the work is. And once you do that, of course, we've learned that the vital importance of prioritizing the work. You can't just have a huge stack of documents that you're going to work on and say, well, we'll just pick wherever to start. No, we need to work on the most important things first. Whatever tool you use to prioritize them, doesn't matter. That's up to you, but you have to find some way to prioritize it. And then the recognition that we've learned that it's not done until we're all done. In the old days, if you were, let's say, a business analyst, you'd write your requirements documents and you say, well, I'm done. I'm out. I wrote my requirements documents, posted them. I'm done. I'm on to the next project. That's not true. Again, it's not done until we're all done. We have to see the work across the finish line. And of course, in order to do this, we've learned the importance of having that shared vision, that focus to know what is the most important thing right now and how are we working towards that. Again, this is separate from any practice. Things we've learned about understanding the work. You won't get it right the first time. We used to legit think we could, which is weird to think that we actually thought if we planned enough, we hired enough business analysts, we could actually get it right the first time. I worked for a company and they would have waterfall projects that would fail. They would fail spectacularly. People would work crazy hours trying to get it out the door. And eventually it would get out the door. Customer would be miserable. And the CEO of the company would have an all hands meeting and say, next time, we're going to do it right. We're going to hire more business analysts. We're going to do more analysis. We're going to make sure they sign on the dotted line so they have agreed about what we're building. There will be no changes allowed, and we will be successful. And then it would fail. And then he would get up there again. He'd say the same thing. This time, more business analysts, more planning. And of course, this would just make the projects longer and more fragile and more likely to fail. And then they would, and the company did eventually go out of business, not surprisingly. The other thing we've learned is, of course, if you build it, they probably won't come. Again, we, for some reason, used to think, hey, we got this great idea. We just have to build it however long it takes, because when it hits the market, they're going to love it. Turns out they won't. Which means we have to release early and release often, however we choose to do that. We have to find ways to get that feedback early so that we can inspect and adapt. And then we can do things like validated learning, which we picked up from Lean Startup, right? That build, measure, learn loop is shrinking that feedback loop. Again, whatever practices you use to do it just needs to be done. And one of the ones, and this is one of the ones kind of a pet peeve of mine, is the idea that we need to cut losses quickly. And in Lean Startup, this one known as the minimum viable product. This is one that I don't think we see enough of. I really think we need to do more of this. More projects and products just need to be canceled. It's like you can tell they're on the wrong way, but there's that sunk cost fallacy. People just want to keep going anyways. Really, when we learn we're on the wrong track, we need to cut those losses and move on to something that works. So what have we learned about how the work moves through our system? Well, we learned about flow. This is something we didn't really understand quite as much before. Again, we used to think that we were more productive if we actually had people at 100% utilization. So 100% utilization, then you're getting the maximum money worth. But now we know that just creates bottlenecks. It creates traffic jams and work doesn't flow through the system and everything takes longer. So in response, of course, we learned to limit work in process. And a lot of people associate this with Kanban, but it's not just Kanban because Scrum limits work in progress as well. They do that through the sprint. Again, if you have a sprint, a 1 week, 2 week sprint, there's only so much work you can work on in that period of time. So again, whatever practice you choose to do it, you can find a way. You just need to actually limit the amount of work you have in progress, which means you're going to end up with smaller batch sizes and smaller releases, which will also decrease your risk and will allow you to get to value sooner. Again, you can choose different practices to do all of these aspects, but these are the things we've learned if you want to actually have success. So let's move on to crafting the work. So autonomy, we've learned that, again, the people doing the work should have a fairly big say on how they do the work because they are closer to the work, they have the information. We learned about the benefits of cross-functional teams. Again, and the point is that we have that availability of the people we need when we need them. And that's why you wanted those cross-functional teams so that you could reduce handoffs. Because we've also learned about how much time the work that we work on actually spends sitting, waiting to be worked on, while we wait for someone else to pick up the work. So the more we can reduce that wait time, the better off we're going to be. We've also learned about being test-driven, and that goes not just, again, for code. So it's not just about writing code and creating your test first, but if you're doing product development, product management, well, what's our hypothesis about what this product is going to do? And so we make that hypothesis, therefore we can check afterwards and see if we are on the right track. And of course, we learned about how automation is how we're going to speed up things. We're not going to get faster by teaching developers to type faster for code. No, what's going to happen is the more things that we can automate are going to allow us to get to market sooner and actually speed up our development time. And lastly, we learned that centralization is not as good as being decentralized. Whereas again, before we had that command and control environment where we wanted everything centralized and controlled and approvals, we now seek to decentralize authority and the work. That means moving the authority to that information. So the people who are closest to the work actually can make decisions about how that work goes in because they're there. They have more information than getting approvals 3 and 4 layers up the chain who are now disconnected from the information and are now going to be the one making the call. Doesn't make sense. We've learned that we need to stop disempowering people. There's all this talk about empowering people. There's really not much you can do to empower anyone. But what we do instead is we do a lot of things to take power away from people. Oh, you did a release and it crashed. Well, we're not going to let you release anymore. We're going to take that power away from you. Now you're going to have to get approval. And then if that doesn't work out, then we get more approvals and we get more signed documents, and we'll take more and more power away from the teams. We've learned to reduce risk through experimentation. Again, however you execute is through you. And then you learn the importance of building clarity and competence throughout your organization, because you can't move the authority to the information. You can't have those people making the change if they don't know the vision on how we're going to change things, and if they don't have the competence to make the change. And so one of the things we actually learned about this is around feeling the consequences of those decisions. So I remember in the early days of DevOps, seemed like a radical idea at the time, was the idea that, why do you have a pager going off in the middle of the night for an ops person or for a person, a maintenance team, when the person who actually knows how the code works is sleeping soundly in the night and they don't feel the consequences of their bad code or their code decisions. When instead, when you put the pager on them, they look at it and say, oh, I didn't think it would work this way, but I know how to fix it. And then you give them the authority to make that change. Suddenly, you get a lot of improvement through doing that. So you have to understand that all these practices we do, they are there to support these aspects, these ideas that we have learned. You're going to have a big physical board that you're going to have stickies on. Why? Transparency. It's going to go back to transparency, right? So all of these things support one of these aspects. You could do a different practice, but you're going to have to find one that supports transparency. So if you're just applying Scrum practices in a completely different context, I beg of you, I plead of you, just stop it. Please, just stop it. Because we have to start questioning old practices. So we have all these practices that have been around for like 20 years now. You have things like sprints, stand-ups, story points, retrospectives, and you have pair programming, now mob programming, or whatever they call it now. Your sprint reviews, your demos, user stories, all these things. You should be questioning all of them. That doesn't mean to get rid of them, it means question them. So for example, if you're a team that started doing mob programming, that means everybody is getting together, working on a single item at a time, going through priority. You're taking the top priority item. As a whole team, we're going to get it done. Do you need sprints? Do you need to do a stand-up? And the answer is, and it may surprise you, maybe. The answer is not an obvious yes or no. Because you might say, well, why do we have sprints if we're just taking whatever is coming next and we'll just deal with that? But then your team might say, you know what, we like the cadence, the heartbeat of having that sprint and having those kind of moments to reflect on things. And we actually like that. It's like, cool, either one is fine. You could do either one because, again, it's still, you're still getting the benefits that you would from doing it. You're still limiting work in progress like you might do in a sprint. Same thing when you look at a daily scrum or a stand-up. Should we do it? Maybe, right? You might say, well, it's kind of pointless because we're all just working on the same thing at the same time anyway, so we're going to ramp up no matter what. But then your team might say, but you know what? We kind of like to just get our heads in the same space and kind of collect our thoughts and thinking about what we're going to do today and having that moment to do that. Cool. Whatever's going to work, because again, you're satisfying those aspects. So what we really need to do at this point, which is different than what's been done in the last probably at least 5 years, maybe 10 years, is we need to start doing agile with your brain on again. Because there was a time, obviously, when in the early days, when it was the innovators in there, where people were trying stuff, you had no choice but to think about it, because you had to see, like, is this working? Is this not? But then there came a time where people were copying approaches that they say, well, I can just turn my brain off and just do what Scrum says, do whatever so-and-so says. It doesn't matter. You can't do that anymore. You have to turn your brain on and start thinking about these things. And you need to do this because no one is coming to save your agile. Whatever the market says, whatever is going on, there's going to be no Agile 2.0 that saves things, or future Agile, or, there's all kinds of things out there with all kinds of names. None of them are likely to have the success that the original manifesto had. So no one is going to come and save Agile, and it's going to have its reputation in the market, which is going to have people saying bad things about it and people who may say good things about it, but it doesn't matter. And this is why, I say here in our part 7 here, as we start to wrap up, is Agile is dead. But here's why that's a good thing. So let's talk about why that's a good thing right now. So it's really a good thing because at the end of the day, Agile doesn't matter. Really doesn't. Again, like I said, I didn't get into this to be Agile. That's not why I did this. I got into this because I had problems in organizations that I wanted to solve, and I was looking for solutions. So Agile doesn't actually matter. So what does matter then? Well, you matter. You who's listening to this talk right now, you matter. The reason you're here is, again, because there is some things you're trying to do in your organization. You're trying to figure out how to improve them, how to get them done. Because fixing your organization matters, and it matters not just for you, but for you and those that you work with, your teams and your organizations, to be happy, to be successful, to make money and stay in business. I mean, the things that I saw people suffer through pre-Agile, like, it was crazy. It was really a crazy time. And again, there are still problems now. There are still problems to solve. And our goal, again, is to find and solve those problems. So I'll tell you, like, I don't have all the answers. As Arthur C. Clarke said, I don't pretend to have all the answers, but the questions are certainly worth thinking about. So I want you to walk away from this talk thinking about these things. And I want you to ask yourself, did you ever think in around like 2001, when the Agile Manifesto was coming together, did you ever think it'd be cool to be there in that place, uncovering better ways of working and trying other things and helping other people do things? Well, great, because now's your chance. You're here. Because the cut and paste Agile era is kind of over, and yes, it is dead. But we still need people to actually turn their brains on and actually try and solve the problems that we have. Because once you understand the rules, you can break the rules. That's how you find new things. But you have to understand why we do the things we do. But once you have that, now it's time to try some new things. I give you permission to break all the rules. So if they say, "What are you doing? That's not Scrum. That's not this," and just say, "Well, Todd said it's okay. It's okay for us to break the rules. I'll take the blame. It's okay." Because we have to bring back that do-it-yourself ethic. We have to do that in order to actually move things forward and get momentum going on this movement again. Because we have to remember, it's our job to uncover better ways, not just to regurgitate the ones of the old. We have to uncover the better ways. So as I mentioned in the beginning, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be launching a little free course to those on my mailing list about how to do Agile with your brain on, and how to apply these aspects of Agile to figure out what's going to work for us. How do we try things? How do we evaluate them? How do we figure the processes and practices that we want to apply in our organization? And again, feel free to reach out to me if you want help with your organization to do this. And there's my contact information. Actually, let me zoom back up because that doesn't have the mailing list on there. On that one, I'll go to this one. So if you want to get the free course, then just sign up to that right there. Mailing list. Again, you can follow me on X or Twitter and email me or reach out to me on LinkedIn. But that's all I have to say about Agile being dead. So I am free to take any questions. If Lawrence and the gang want to see if there are any questions going on, I will field those. But otherwise, thank you very much.
Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and fire away.
Love the talk. I love to do Agile with your brain on. It's very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I guess you could also pop a question into the chat if you wanted to do that way instead. So somebody would like, Todd, for you to go back to the moving the work slide. There's a final bullet there they didn't catch.
I can do that, yes. Moving the work, here we go. Oh, it's crafting the work, moving the work. Round one. Understanding the work. There we go. Get to value sooner. That's the last one.
Okay. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to speak up. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. Okay. Well, Todd, it would seem that you covered the topic well. There aren't a lot of questions.
I guess so. Everyone has all the
But
answers now, apparently.
your information's here. If you know you need to reach out to or want to reach out to Todd separately, feel free to do so. That's part of the benefit, I guess, of doing one of these presentations. Is it helps makes contacts and follow-ups. So Todd, thank you again for a great presentation. Haven't seen you in 5 years, unfortunately, but it was good to have you back here and have you join us for this presentation. And I think I'm seeing lots of positive comments in the chat rolling through. So I think you impressed everybody who came out and joined us tonight. And so thank you to everybody who did join us, and thank you again, Todd, for covering this topic for us. And Gautam, thank you for the great introduction. So with that, we'll wrap up, and I'll say good night to everybody, and thanks again for coming aboard. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks all. Thanks, Todd. Very captivating.
Yeah, thank you, Gautam.
Yeah, and your